You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics to culture and the arts.
Hello, my name is Osman Butt, and you're watching Middle East Conversations, MEMO Conversations. My guest today is Walaa Quisay. Walaa is a Postdoctoral Research Associate at the University of Manchester, researching non-violent civil disobedience in contemporary Islamic thought. She completed her first book to be published with Edinburgh University Press on Neo-Traditionalism in the West. She was a teaching fellow at the University of Birmingham and Istanbul Sahel University. She also received her DPhil from the University of Oxford and at the Faculty of Oriental Studies. Her research interests include Muslim political subjectivities, popular political theology, theodicy, spirituality, and traditionalism and modernism in contemporary Islamic thought. Walaa, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thank you so much.
So you have published a new article, and in this article you discuss the problems of theodicy in Egypt pre and post the Rabaa massacre in 2014. What was it about this topic that drew you towards it, and what were your key findings?
So firstly, I think what was quite fascinating, but I say this as it's not fascinating in a happy way, but there was a sense that the trauma that was brought on by the Rabaa massacre has caused people to lose sense of meaning in many ways. And so at that time, there was a form of fear-mongering amongst particularly some older people about Mawjat al-Ilhad, or a wave of atheism that was spreading amongst the youth. And that was quite a popular thing to discuss at a particular point in time. I don't agree with the notion of Mawjat al-Ilhad or a wave of atheism, but there was a notable shift in the religious practice of young people as a result of trauma. And the religious practice was subsumed within a whole crisis of meaning, and forming relations. So I'd spoken to my supervisor at the time about it, Dr. Muhammad Talib in Oxford. And I'd also become quite interested in Holocaust and post-Holocaust theology, particularly Elie Wiesel. He had a book called The Trial of God, in which he discussed the problem of theodicy, or the problem of suffering, or just God's justice in the aftermath of what happened to the Jews. So I was interested in how trauma breeds indignation and loss of trust in divine justice on the one hand, or not even a loss of trust, a kind of longing for divine justice or divine intervention in a way in the world, and goodness and humanity. Those are the two things. So even if you have someone who kind of lost faith or are feeling kind of threatened in that category, there is a sense of lingering of hope. So I was also interested in another book called Facing the Abusing God, A Theology of Protest by David Blumenthal, in which he compares how Jewish survivors of childhood trauma and abuse, severe childhood trauma, and survivors of the Holocaust deal with the big question of why did this happen? Why did God let it happen? And how could people around us let this happen? And that goes on to like their musings on the Bible, the book of Job. So I have a little passage from Elie Wiesel's book that really, really drew me. And it's sort of about someone who was in the face of like complete loss of faith. So he says, I want to blaspheme, but I can't quite manage it. I go up against him as in God. I shake my fist, I froth with rage. It's a way of telling him that he is there. he exists and that he's never the same twice, and that a denial in of itself is an offering to his grandeur. The shout becomes a prayer in spite of me. And that's something that I found quite touching and quite compelling in, and it's a missing point in the discourse on the big boogeyman of Mawjat al-Ilhad, is that people are kind of longing for a sense of meaning. So in that, I became interested in how meanings of suffering were constructed before Rab'a in the different tribulations or trials that Islamist activists have undergone. And the most compelling one was Sayyid Qutb's work. But there's another thing that was interesting in this. So my supervisor tried to kind of push me away and kind of expand my intellectual boundaries. And he said that we kind of live under the shadow of the secularization thesis, right? We always assume that religion is about to decline, or when it doesn't do that, we say there is a religious revival. And so there is always the point of, decline or coming back out of nowhere. But there isn't a sense that religiosity or religion or spirituality always exists, and the conditions that it's put under transforms it in different ways. And this is where popular political theology becomes very important, because the way people invoke God or suffering or justice, the way they make senses of surahs of the Quran or particular phrases or whatever, that becomes very, very important in the way they construct a constellation of meaning. So this is how I became interested in the question of suffering. And then when I started to do so, I found out that there was an array of literature already out there in Arabic, activists writing about divine justice, about the silence of God, about free will, the free will of the oppressor to oppress, the devil, in a kind of Iqbalian sense, and shakwat. So that became very interesting. And then the other side of it is Surah al-Buruj, the story of the martyrs in the ditch, the Christians of Najran, becomes a very, very salient theme. And for its obvious reason, people were persecuted and they were thrown into the ditch. But there are other dimensions to it. And the most important one, and this is what Qutb writes about, is the fact that, in the story of the Christians of Najran, God does not save the believers from the ditch, and they in fact die, right? And so God's justice does not necessarily need to be on this earth, and there is an idea of otherworldly retribution. But then there's more immediate kinds of sensory aspects of the surah that become very, very important for survivors of the massacre. The idea of fire, being burnt with fire, being thrown, the bodies thrown in a ditch. These imageries are very, very important and very compelling to people who saw, the bodies of the martyrs in Rab'a being thrown into the mosque, at the hospital, the idea of the panic, the fear. So there is a sensory aspect of the surah that becomes very, very compelling in the way that it was in the Quran, and how it kind of reflects in their very, very traumatic experience.
Yes, and you could you perhaps, because a very key aspect of the things we're talking about here is how, because on the one hand we've got the activists, right, and they're sort of trying to make sense of the world post the Rab'a massacre, but we also have a parallel thing going on where the state itself is using popular religious discourses and theodicy as part of its own discourse. Could you perhaps tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So in my article, when I wrote about state theodicy, I thought there was a particular clip of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi that I found very, very interesting. And he uses religious discourse quite a lot to legitimize his violence. So he said something to the effect, if we were in fact unjust, or had we been aggressors, God would not have graced us with his victory. But with the grace of Allah, glorified and exalted be he, and by our virtues and values, victory is the gift that God will always bestow upon us. So there is a sense that we're here for a reason. We survived this for a reason. This is something that, again, theoretically, it's quite fascinating, because when we talk purely in from a theological perspective, the question of theodicy relates to suffering, the problem of suffering. But early on, even Max Weber noted in his Protestant Ethic that the question of suffering really, really, really leads us to ask the question of privilege, right? So this wasn't something that was new in the literature. So Weber said, the fortunate is seldom satisfied with the fact of being fortunate. Beyond that, he needs to know that he has a right to good fortune. Good fortune thus wants to be legitimate fortune. And this is what we see. So we have a theodicy for the oppressed, and the oppressors also have a theodicy to justify their sense of privilege. And this doesn't necessarily need to, I just want to illustrate how salient this theme is. So you have a neoliberal capitalistic order, right? And there's a sense of even secular theodicy that embeds this. Why are some people rich and some people poor? It's not because the poor people don't work hard enough, even though that is a contention that some people have. But actually, there needs to be a class difference in order to maintain this neoliberal order. And therefore, neoliberalism in of itself creates categories of people deserving of poverty and deserving of wealth and fortune. And so that's something that becomes quite compelling. And the other person, or the other kind of theorist that I depended on, was Peter Berger. In his Sacred Canopy, he has a chapter on theodicy. And it's very, very interesting, because he makes a very, very compelling point that theodicy is a function of world making. So it makes it gives you an understanding of how the world works and who deserves what categories are there. And sometimes he says that the oppressed and the oppressor have not contradictory, they have theodicies that are different, but they kind of fit within one another. But then once there's a disintegration in the plausibility structures of these theodicies, like we had in Rab'a, where people don't have that meaning to suffering anymore, where that meaning is severed, then that has potential for a revolutionary sort of growth or outburst. And there's a sense also, which is quite fascinating, where he says there's certain theodicies that have a kind of messianic, that there's a savior that's going to come out there. And religious ideologies tend to have that, whether they want to or not, that, once there is this state, or once Islamic law, or once justice, any of these big things, once they rule supreme, there's a sense that there won't be any necessary suffering anymore. These become devalued when the messianic leader, or the person who was awaited for, comes to power, and he is realized to be a mundane person. He's a normal person. And I think Berger notes the Mahdi in Sudan as an example, but you can also see that within the Islamist case, where Mursi, Allah yarhamu, his leadership was much more mundane and didn't live up to the expectations that a lot of the revolutionary youth kind of had. And so there's a sense that these big ideals don't necessarily need to make much sense. And so in this part, I kind of owe a lot of my theoretical and sort of my thinking to this other article that I found very, very compelling, called Governing Uncertainty in a Secular Age, Rationalities of Violence, Theodicy and Torture, which talked about how in the war on terror, uncertainty was used to authorize violence against people whose subjectivities were seen as threatening to the national order. So you are a potential terrorist. You're potentially going to disturb our livelihoods, and therefore, if you do so, then the whole, like, people who are deserving of privilege will no longer have. And so there's a sense that these despotic regimes use uncertainty, that fear of uncertainty, to authorize violence against particular people who they deem will threaten the world order, or it will threaten the world making of the state. And so they deem their subjectivities as inherently deserving of suffering and deserving of pain. So I use this in the context of Rab'a, where people who were sympathetic to Mursi, or people that belong to the Muslim Brotherhood, or people who had, outwardly, they looked religious in particular ways. They represented this imminent danger towards the world making that happened post-coup. But this is something that I really want to stress. This isn't the only kind of secular theodicy that the state employed. During the Maspero massacre, the massacre of the Copts, you had television channels using very, very sectarian language against the Coptic protesters, saying that these people threaten the Islamic nature of the state. And so in that particular instance, the Coptic protesters, who were non-violent, who were demanding very justified demands, represented this imminent danger towards the world making at that particular time. And so state theodicy functions in a way to deem people's subjectivities as subversive, as deserving of suffering, so everyone can survive. And so this is the part of state theodicy that I wanted to kind of expand upon in my paper.
Yes, and you are also currently speaking specifically, because we're talking about the state here and its repression. You're also researching theology and political prisoners, right? So Egypt obviously has, there's a lot of people in prison in Egypt right now who have been put there for political reasons. But you're currently doing research into the theological aspects of being a political prisoner in Egypt. Could you perhaps tell us more about this research and its significance?
Sure. So I'm currently working on two major projects and kind of one other project that's related to them. The first project is a project with Asim Qureshi, where we look at fiqh, or carceral fiqh, the fiqh of imprisonment, and we look at the different practices and the different issues that come up within these contexts, and particularly that there have been some books that were written on fiqh of imprisonment in Arabic, not too many, but there's a lot of anecdotes and there are a lot of stories of, because prisons are an unusual state of being, and they're about controlling the body, they're about controlling the soul, they're about breaking down the body and the soul. So spirituality and religion become a way for people to regain their autonomy. I don't want to make it utilitarian as that religion is a use for something else, but religion becomes very, very, very important in prison. So we look at, issues that might seem mundane but are quite compelling. For example, if the prison doesn't have water, if the prison authorities is using that as a way to kind of control, how do people pray? How do they make tayammum? If they're bound, if their hands are bound, how do they pray? How do they make wudu? How do they make tayammum? So these are issues, and the fact that these are important to the prisoners tells you a lot about how the body functions, how spirituality is related to autonomy and the body, and how it's a form of resistance in a way against a state of being that tries to control your every aspect of your life. So when you're in solitary confinement, how do you pray? How do you know where the qibla is? How do you know when to when Fajr is and when Maghrib is when you're fasting? So there are issues related to that. If a prisoner gets killed in prison by the guards, do you pray Salat al-Ghaib or Salat al-Janaza for them? Could you make ghusl of them? Or do the prison guards take the body? So there's a lot of masail that come up. There are a lot of issues that come up, but it reflects a very, very sad state of being where people are not, the fact that they're not able to practice faith properly is an indication to how coercive and how utterly despicable the prison system is. And so this is one project that I'm working on, and a sub-project of that, or actually an independent project of that, is I'm working on the fiqh of hunger strikes in prison. So I look at the question of hunger strike and its permissibility. And in doing so, I interview two sets of people. I interview ulama and scholars who have an opinion on the matter regarding its permissibility, and they engage in polemics. And I interview former detainees who went on hunger strikes, or their families who know a little bit about their experience. And I try to see how religious discourses are mobilized in order to control these people. And generally, the question of self-destruction, like to what extent, because, there is a fiqh principle of, you can't harm yourself. You can't cause yourself tahluka in a way. So do the carceral conditions transform fatwa production? That's the thing that I'm quite fascinated with. And the last project that I'm working on related to prison theology is something with Basit Iqbal on endurance and fatigue in Islamist carceral theology. We're still trying to figure out the parts and bits that we will sort of engage with. But just conducting interviews now, I think one thing that really, really comes to mind, or actually two things that come to mind. The first being Surat Yusuf being very, very significant for prisoners. Surat Yusuf is one of the most significant surahs of the Quran in guiding and giving hope. And the second thing is something that Asim Qureshi wrote an article about, which I, through my interviews, found out that, wow, this is a bigger theme than I ever thought. The fact that prisoners' dreams are very, very, very important. Every former prisoner you talk to, particularly those that were in solitary confinement, can tell you about a ru'ya they had, about a vision they had. And in prisons, typically, like from the interviews I conducted, there's someone in prison that knows how to interpret dreams. And so dreams become a way for prisoners to think that this is a message from God, giving them hope, giving them a sense of optimism, giving them a sense of sabr and sumud, so it becomes quite important. So that's something I'm thinking about, but I'm not sure if I'm going to incorporate it in that piece quite yet.
Yes, it's a very fertile area. It's interesting that dreams are still finding their way to, because obviously it's an old Islamic motif that you believe in your dreams and that you interpret your dreams. Like the founder of the Ottoman Empire had a dream, founder of Baghdad had a dream.
Yeah.
It's funny to see how it's still, part of everyday life. But another...
Sorry, just one more thing, and it goes back again to Surah Yusuf, where where Sayyidina Yusuf was in prison with two people, and they told him his dream, and he knew that one was going to get out and one was going to be killed, and then Pharaoh had a dream. And so again, there is a sense that dreams and confinement and prisons, there's something, and also the fact that he had a dream at the beginning where he saw the stars and moons bowing to him, and his father said, "Don't tell your brothers the dream." So again, this becomes a sort of like divine gift for the prisoners in order to give them a sense of stability and sumud in their predicament.
Yes, and another area you've explored is neo-traditionalism in Islam. Could you perhaps tell us about this movement and why they matter?
Yeah. So I actually finished my book on the topic. Hopefully it's going through edits right now. I think it's the movement is quite interesting. So for people who don't know what neo-traditionalism is, again, it's a bit of a complicated term just because some people within that movement choose to use it, other people do not. I personally use the term. So within the Western context, it was a group of young sheikhs or young students of knowledge who had studied in the Muslim centers in Mauritania, in Yemen, in Syria, and they came back and they saw that there was a vacuum in knowledge in the Muslim, in the Western Muslim education in a way, and there was quite a salience of Salafism as a sense of this is the proper orthodoxy. You of course had other religious practices that were very dominant and could not be sort of tampered with. You had, particularly in the UK, you have the Deobandis who were pretty strong. You had the Brehlevis who were pretty strong. But I think they came with a very creative and somewhat subversive claim to the religious scene at the time that was dominated by Salafism and different iterations of political Islam. They noted that there is a deep and rich religious tradition that was abandoned in modernity, and that caused a deficit in knowledge, and in turn bred extremism of violence. They also had one other statement that was very, very important, that Sufism is orthodox, that Tasawwuf is orthodox. It's not the heterodox New Age spirituality of sort of the Western academy. And so that became very, very important. And they noted that the tradition was intact in communities that have escaped the ravages of modernity, such as in Mauritania or Tarim in Yemen, and they were personified by saints and ulama. And again, that's something that I do a little bit of unpacking in the book. But I think just for the sake of time, I want to come away with particular takeaways. The imagined past, the past that they imagined was layered and structured in a metaphysical sense. There were metaphysical structures, and there were social structures that kind of mirrored these metaphysical structures of the world, and that kept the world ordered and enchanted and allowed for spirituality to reign free. And that's how the tradition was maintained in the past. And so there's this belief that hierarchies are intrinsic there, whether it's the hierarchy of the leader or of the family or of the saint scholar. So everything is sort of ordered in that way. And that only through stability, whether it's social and political stability or hermeneutic stability, that can cause a sort of cosmic stability in the world. And so that was very important to them. And so there's this contention that modernity causes rupture in which everything became afloat, everything became adrift, everything became liquidized, to use like Bauman's term. And so the hierarchies were undone by socially conscious movements or whatever, and that caused a decline in the world. And so they relate to that in terms of Muslim majority contexts in which they, talk about political Islam causing this decline, or even in the West where they, social justice warriors cause that kind of decline. And so there is a sense that, these movements really kind of disturbed stability and hampered spirituality from progressing. So what I became really interested in looking at is sort of the intersection of a theology that necessitates acquiescence, political and religious acquiescence, and decries power critique, because power critique is something modern, it's something postmodern, which is even scarier, it's cosmically destabilizing, with religious subjectivities of people who don't have access to power. People talk about, how often these young seekers in the spiritual retreats are middle class, well-to-do folk. That's true. Some of them are, some of them are not. Some of them, try and save, try to get. So there is a sense, and you can see a class difference definitely in some of these retreats. So there's a sense of like, how do you bridge that gap between acquiescence and having no access to power or being put upon by power structures. And then there's other aspects of my research where I look at how certain sheikhs within that trend become very important for state actors, how they inform policies, and tasawwuf or Sufism becomes a part of like state branding, as David Warren calls it. So there's an aspect of that, and particularly, the United Arab Emirates. So not to be around the bush, how the UAE uses their critique of power structures, their critique of Islamism, in order, again, like I mentioned earlier, how to deem particular people as inherently subversive, inherently problematic to the world making and to spirituality and religion, and that they're inherently violent in a way. And so you see the UAE conducting mass arrests of activists, whether they're Emirati or not, and really being quite harsh and punitive in their actions. So this is a part of my work. But my concern is, how does something, sort of the movement from a very intellectual critique of modernity and an attempt to reconnect with the tradition as a form of re-enchantment after the disenchantment of modernity, becomes a way where certain meanings are inserted into the modern world in an attempt to re-enchant it, but that causing a kind of discrepancy or there are tensions there. So that's sort of the gist of the book.
Yes, and with all of the different researches you've done, whether it's the Neo-Traditionalists in Islam, the Theodicy project we just discussed, there is essentially a relationship between and also political prisoners. All three areas of research, they deal with relationships to power, authority, and the establishment. And this is also our last question to you. Could you perhaps offer us what that relationship is and how they feature?
Yeah. So, I mean, these contexts are quite radically different. You have the carceral context, you have a post-massacre context, and these are very kind of shocking kind of context. And then you have the context of something that on some sort of level can be seen as mundane, but talks to a larger transformation in the Muslim mindset in the 20th and the 21st century. So the sort of salient theme that I kind of really like to see, or kind of becomes quite important to me, is how people invoke God in times of crisis, whether it's personal crisis, and that's talking to people who are undergoing a crisis of faith, or trying to understand their spirituality in retreats, which are very compelling kind of settings. So there's a sense of like, what does God bring to me now? Like how do I relate my personal subjectivity with the divine? How does he intervene in my personal crises? How do I feel him? Does he give, are there signs? And this is where the question of reenchantment comes in. You know, people start seeing signs everywhere. So that's an aspect of it. And then how do power structures inform set crises is another aspect of it. And this is where religious establishment becomes quite interesting, because I think it's quite it's not super accurate to talk about a religious establishment in Islam as a one thing, right? You have people who have multiple claims for religious authority, and not one group is more learned than the other. There's a sense that, you know, some people are, you know, the intellectual Muslims that don't have depth of knowledge in Islam, and then there's the traditional ulama who have a depth of knowledge in Islam. And the reality is much more complicated than that when you actually look at, you know, the religious upbringing of set people. You know, one thing that I know is, you know, you can have the typical immigrant intellectual Muslim wearing a suit, and he could be passed off as someone who doesn't, you know, who isn't rooted in Islam. But a part of literacy in the 20th century was religious education. So a lot of these people might have spent years and years and years studying under traditional scholars, right? You know, they have depth of knowledge in the madhahib, et cetera, et cetera. And then also you have some people who have claimed to traditional knowledge in from the neo-traditionalist trend, but like are also doctors and engineers and studied 2 years in Al-Azhar and then came back and, you know, wore so the boundaries are much more fluid than we would like to think that they are, right? The caricature of immigrant Islam is much more complicated in reality than they'd have us believe. So again, the question of religious establishment and religious authority is much more complicated. And what I'd like to posit is that the relationship people who have religious authority have to power structures within sort of the religious power structures and within the religious establishment again. So like sorry, I lost my train of thought. So yeah, so the relationship they have to the power structures really informs where they stand and how they mitigate such religious authority. And then there's another thing that becomes quite interesting from that is how we can sort of account for burnout or fatigue, right? Because there's a sense, you know, there was a popular phrase of like the Salafi burnout, and then there are other religious burnouts. And we have this secularization thesis embedded that these people were religious and now they're not, where actually it is a point of transformation. So the question becomes, where once an idea that was propped up by a particular religious authority figure once sustained us and became intelligible in our religious worldview, why does it no longer sustain us now? And what are the implications of that? And these are the questions that I like to deal with.
So where can our audience find your work and keep up to date with your research?
It's still a work in progress. So I have my article out, Competing Theodicies, and it's published in Political Theology Journal article. I had one article that I wrote with Thomas Parker many years ago called On the Theology of Obedience. Hopefully in the next year, year and a half, more stuff will come out. So my work on carceral fiqh and hunger strikes, I'm still conducting interviews, but hopefully I'll have a draft in a couple of months, and then after the edits, it should be out. But yeah.
Walaa, thank you for talking to us at Middle East Conversations. And to our audience, I'd like to thank you for tuning in. Please do tune in again next week for another Memo Live.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.